Good morning from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. Israeli rockets continued to strike Gaza early this morning as the bloody conflict between Israeli forces and Palestinian militants entered its fourth day. And after testimony yesterday by former CIA Director General David Petraeus, Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid says he will not convene a special panel to investigate the attacks on the U.S. consulate in Benghazi in September. We will be talking about both those stories in depth on tomorrow's show. But right now, I am joined by George Gale, Executive Director of National People's Action, which advocates for racial and economic justice, Heather McGhee, Vice President of the progressive think tank Demos, New York Democratic Congressman and friend of the show Jerry Nadler, and MSNBC contributor Joy Reid, managing editor of our sister website, thegrio.com. Great to have you all here. On a conference call with donors this week, portions of which were posted online by ABC News, Mitt Romney blamed his loss to President Obama on what he called gifts the president had given to core Democratic constituencies like students, women, and Latinos.
What the president's campaign did was focus on certain members of his base coalition, give them extraordinary financial gifts from the government, and then work very aggressively to turn them out to vote.
Just note that, deferred action on deporting people doesn't actually cost any money, but it's just a side point. Romney's framing of the president's campaign strategy is, of course, craven, mean-spirited, and offensive, but it is also not entirely inaccurate. The president did indeed deliver on some of the major policy priorities of those core Democratic constituencies: mandatory insurance coverage for birth control, making student loans more affordable, and deferring action, as I said, on the deportation of young, undocumented immigrants, among other things. Romney calls those gifts. Progressives, and in many cases a majority of Americans, would call them good policy. But what Republicans seem to be picking up on is that key components of the president's coalition exerted considerable leverage over the White House during the presidential campaign. Now, as we enter the fight over what I and some others are calling the fiscal curb, the combination of tax increases and spending cuts set to start on January 1st, the question is, will the left retain any of that leverage over the president, or has it disappeared? On Tuesday, a group of union leaders and progressive organizers met with President Obama at the White House. Lee Saunders, president of AFSCME, the American Federation of State, Court, and Municipal, State, County, and Municipal Employees, said the coalition that reelected President Obama would remain intact to pressure lawmakers during the standoff over the fiscal curb.
What we're going to do is keep our members mobilized and organized in the different communities across the country. We're going into another campaign. We won the election, but we're going into another campaign now.
For his part, President Obama reiterated on Wednesday the election had delivered a clear verdict on the question of whether taxes should be raised on income over $250,000.
If there was one thing that everybody understood was a big difference between myself and Mr. Romney, it was when it comes to how we reduce our deficit, I argued for a balanced, responsible approach, and part of that included making sure that the wealthiest Americans pay a little bit more. I think every voter out there understood that that was an important debate, and the majority of voters agreed with me.
President Obama met with congressional leaders yesterday to begin the talks, and House Speaker John Boehner suggested the parties could reach broad agreement on revenue targets and savings from entitlement reforms to avoid the immediate budget cuts. The leaders said they would meet again after Thanksgiving. All right, Congressman Nadler, before we get to this political question, because I think the political question is really important, I think that some of the stuff we saw in the election year really was the product of election year dynamics, and in a positive way. I mean,
that's why we have elections.
That's exactly right. People say, well, that's politics. Well, yes, that's also known as democracy. It's also known as accountability. There's nothing wrong with that, right? Before we get to the politics of that, and George, I want to bring you on that question. Substantively, what do you want to see? I mean, if you were to say, Jerry Nadler, I make you emperor of America or emperor of these negotiations, and you get to sign a document, and that's what we get. What is the end point you would like to see?
The end point I would like to see is something we're not going to get, given the fact that the Republicans control the House. But what I would like to see is much less of an emphasis on the deficit, which is a long-term, maybe a medium-term problem, but not an immediate problem, and a concentration on getting people back to work and curing this economy. So I would like to see much more spending on infrastructure. The government can borrow money now at negative interest rates. They're paying us to take money off their hands. Borrow more money, have a temporary increase in the deficit, frankly. Use that to invest in infrastructure, schools, hospitals, roads, bridges, smart electric grid, protection against hurricanes, whatever, which will make us more competitive in the long run.
Right.
Number one. Number two, give money to state and local governments, as we did in the stimulus bill, but haven't been doing since then, so that they don't continue laying off police officers and firefighters and teachers and so forth, and make investments in education in the next generation. And if we did that, put people back to work, get the economy moving again, if we got unemployment down to 5%, which is where it was in 2007, that by itself would reduce the deficit by 40%.
Yeah, that's a really
That's
good
what
point.
I'd like to see.
So short-term stimulus, a combination of ways of focusing on getting
but
the full
not just
employment.
short-term stimulus, long-term
Investments, right.
Because those
Right.
investments in infrastructure are key.
Right.
We used to invest close to 3% of GDP in infrastructure pre-Reagan. Now we invest less than 1%.
Yeah.
China invests 9%.
Yeah.
Who do you think is going to be more competitive 30 years from now in terms of an efficient economy?
George, National People's Action has been mobilizing around these issues. You were just arrested last week, I think, in the offices of Senator Dick Durbin, Illinois Senator. Now, someone might hear that and say, well, why are you going after Senator Dick Durbin? He's your friend. He's your ally. He's a Democrat. He's a fairly progressive Democrat in the Senate. Why were you in his offices getting arrested?
I think that the first Obama term was like a dress rehearsal for progressives. Like, we got some stuff right, but at the end of the day, it was like we got him elected and we thought he would govern and we'd work in unison. And this time around, I think we got to inject way more post-election accountability, both to the administration, but also to any electeds. And so, yeah, Senator Durbin's a great ally of ours. We work with him on a bunch of stuff, but he's been part of this gang of 6 or gang of 8, depending on the story, and, really trending in the wrong direction.
It's a bipartisan group of senators in the House who had been working together to try to hammer out some kind of deal they could then take to the full Senate.
Which they seem to be backing away from, saying that they've got a shot at doing that. But I think that we need to, in this second chance, we're past the dress rehearsal, is actually get out on the streets, put tension. Two of the big things that President Obama did that he didn't plan on doing: we blocked the Keystone Pipeline, so people added tension into the relationship, and the DREAM Act work.
Right.
And those were both times where people actually put tension into the relationship, put people in the streets, and made the administration react. And I think this time around, it can't just be a handful of us doing that. We need a broader set of folks.
What's your ask in that office? What do you want to see?
I think we actually want to broaden the conversation. It feels like it started off in completely the wrong place.
Yeah.
It's like Congressman Adler just said, we started off with deficits. And so that was the frame. And actually, we should be talking about the bigger crisis, which is the jobs deficit and like a fairness deficit. And so how do we expand the number of revenue options on the table? Like, nobody's talking about the financial speculation tax in this debate. So, Obama's now got $1.6 trillion on the table, which is certainly better than where we were last year. But why not add the financial speculation tax, which, if you went with Congressman Ellisman's bill, that would be, $3 trillion over 10 years, close more tax loopholes, tax shelters, Cayman Island stuff. We could generate real revenue. Yeah,
one of the things it says, we have a graphic here that shows some of the revenue options, and one of the things that always gets said is, and Ed Conard said here, that's a carbon tax. There are different proposals, right, and different modeling for it. A carbon tax is one of them. We could raise taxes on income over $250,000. That's on the table from the president. We could repeal capital gains tax break, financial transaction tax. Or we could limit
those figures are annual or for 10 years?
Those are over 10 years. Yeah, those are over 10 years. So there's, and again, it depends on how you structure this and what the actual financial transaction tax number is, right? But you can end up in a situation where you can get a lot of revenue, right? I mean, one of the ways in which the conversation has been constrained is this idea of, well, it can't all be done on the revenue side. Well, who says it can't all be done on the revenue side? Taxes as a percentage of GDP are the lowest they've been since the 1950s, right, Heather?
Right, and we have already done it all on the spending side.
That's right.
And that's one of the things that this sort of straitjacket of the conversation always misses, is that we have actually done, because of the debt ceiling deal, the Budget Control Act, about $1.5 million in spending.
Trillion and a half.
$1.5 trillion in spending cuts.
Right.
And we have a discretionary budget caps right now, which has been a long time conservative aim, and we are looking at, in the out years, the lowest amount of federal spending, as a share of our economy in about 50 years. And that just doesn't make any sense if you look at what's actually going on with the working and middle class in this country.
One way,
that's before any spending cuts that they're about to negotiate.
Exactly.
Right. I mean,
So
that's
we've already done it.
One of the ways to
spending
look
side.
at it is, I mean, I think one of the ways to look at it is like elections have consequences, right? And like they won the midterms and they whooped up real bad on the Democrats in the midterms, and they provoked the debt ceiling crisis, and we got the Budget Control Act, and that was a bill that reflected their priorities and the mandate they interpreted as having when they ran a run, and those are locked in 1.5 trillion cuts. Now we just had another election, and the Democrats whooped up on them, and so it's like the centerpiece of the conversation should be shifting.
Yep.
But Joy, as someone who covers this, I don't feel like the centerpiece has shifted except on the one issue the president mentioned, which is taxes at the top.
Right. It's interesting because I think that it is a beltway fetish, this idea of tackling the deficit. Right. And I think that is both in Washington on Capitol Hill, but also in the media. The media, the beltway press, I think, has bought into this idea that deficits are the primary conversation we should be having. But if you look at it as a historic matter, you know, what did FDR do wrong? After injecting a huge amount of stimulus into the economy, he gave in to this temptation to attack deficits, and he did austerity, which plunged the country back into a recession. What did Europe do wrong? They responded to this huge economic crisis with austerity, and in the case of the Great Britain, they went into a double-dip recession. Their economy is flatlined because of austerity. So, you know, President Obama has a great opportunity to not make the mistakes of history and not make the mistakes of Europe. Austerity doesn't work. And the other issue is when we talk about that budget fight, what you're saying accurately, that after 2010, we said, okay, we're going to try austerity. We're going to do what the Republicans want, which is cut. We found out how difficult it is to find things to shave off the budget. There are only a few things to cut. There's defense, there's Social Security. What are the big items in the budget? There isn't a lot out there.
Well, particularly when you talk about non-defense discretionary spending, which is basically the lowest level it's been in a generation.
Right.
But Congressman, I want to hear about what how the politics of this can change. I think there's some consensus at the table about what broadly the vision you want to head towards. But the big question is how to get from here to there right after this break. So we have a conversation that's happening in Washington, D.C., the center of which to me seems wrong, the focus of which seems wrong, not on mass unemployment and the massive waste of resources and livelihoods and human happiness that is represented by that, just at an emotional level, just like it's like causing psychic destruction amongst our fellow citizens and depression for no good reason. Like we can fix it. That's not the conversation. The conversation's about what are the projections of the balance of payments in 2026. Okay, fine. So then the question is, as a member of the United States Congress and as a member of the minority in the United States Congress, in the House of Representatives, what can be done? What are the actual political points of leverage to change this? Or do we just sit here on my show and be like, oh, they're saying the wrong thing? And blah, blah, blah.
The main point of leverage is a so-called fiscal cliff, which isn't really a cliff, but the fact is that come January 1st or so, when all the Bush tax cuts, including those on people below $250,000, expire, when the payroll tax cut expires, the alternative minimum tax hikes up, sequestration for $1.2 trillion kicks in, and various other tax breaks for low and moderate income people go away. That will hit the economy hard. And everyone wants to avoid that. Now, we don't have to avoid it on January 1st.
Right.
If we make an agreement on February 1st or March 1st, you can make it retroactive, etc. People get nervous, but we can do that. There's no hard deadline, really. But the one leverage we really have against the pure Republicans saying what they've been saying is that all the leverage changes on January 1st.
Right.
Because right now, you've got to vote to extend taxes, and they're saying we're not going to vote to extend the tax cuts without everybody's tax cuts, not just for people under $250,000.
Right.
After January 1st, the tax cuts expire.
Right.
They're gone. Everybody's taxes have gone up, and now you come in with a bill and you say, let's reduce the following taxes, and dare the Republicans to vote against.
So I've heard that. Is that the strategy? Is that what you want to see happen, or?
Well, I guess I think the one thing it seems like we all agree on is that we have the wrong starting point. And deficits are the frame, and that's where we're starting. And so we need to break that up. And then, at least I feel like the election created some opening. So we have this kind of fairness moment in America. And I think actually Occupy played a big role in that. I think people were feeling something wasn't working, feeling a lack of fairness in their lives, and then somebody named it. Right. And then it became real. It gave credence to what people were feeling. And then the election, I think, was about many things, but I think it was about fairness. So I think to actually, I mean, an insider strategy will only get us so far in a fight that's starting up on such a bad place. So what are we going to do? You've got to go out and engage constituents all across the country to get into this. And I think with a fiscal cliff frame also is like, I was in a cab on my way to the airport yesterday to get here, and the cabbie was like, they just got to fix this fiscal cliff because like the world's going to come to an end. And it's like, and we started saying, no, it's the inequality cliff. Like we actually could go off the inequality cliff.
That's very deliberate. That frame is very deliberate to frighten people and to set up the political matrix in which people will do things they would never otherwise do, such as voting to cut Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, which would normally be unthinkable. Now, well, you got to do it to have a balanced solution to prevent us from going over the fiscal cliff.
And it's also a Wall Street frame. I mean, I think it's amazing the extent to which, despite the fact that we've had Occupy, despite the fact that the Wall Street, their ultimate candidate, Mitt Romney, who is them embodied, right, lost the election, we still frame everything in terms of what will hit the street, what will happen to Wall Street, which has made tremendous profits over the last 4 years. They haven't been hurt at all, but they're so terrified of this fiscal cliff. It's their frame.
And you know what the irony of this, and we had Ed Conard on last week as former partner of Bain Capital, the irony of this is that you have the two things are happening simultaneously, and the cognitive dissonance here is amazing. On the one hand, as actors in the political sphere, people in the 1% and in finance and Wall Street are saying, oh my God, we're screwed. Our deficits are going to be too big, and it's going to mean huge interest rates and a run on U.S. Treasuries, right? This is how they talk when they're in the sphere of politics. Then during their day job, when they're trading bonds, right? The actual yields on the bond prices, which is a market reflection. These are people who believe that market prices convey the right information, the prices it in. When they're in their day job trading the bonds, it's historically low yields. Everyone just cannot give the U.S. government money fast enough. And then they leave their job, and then they sell it down to Washington, and they say, oh my God, it's a total disaster. The whole thing's going to blow up. And then they go back to trading their bonds.
And by the way, I saw someone on the news mention the other day, it's 448 days or something like that since the U.S. Was downgraded by one of the rating agencies. And what are we going to do about it? And what it shows is nothing happened. The rating agency was dumb. That's all it showed.
I want you to talk out this, this idea of like direct action or educate. Like, I want you to talk me through where that goes, because it seems to me like, people are going to say, well, look, sorry, the Republicans control the House of Representatives, and like, we got to deal with them. So I want to hear more on that when we come back.
Sure.
All right, so you go to a senator's office and you get arrested, or you have a group of people, and I don't want to minimize that. It's a lot of work to like do that, and like it's not fun to be arrested. But I'm just saying, like, what is, there is this disconnect, and I think we all agree on that. There's this conversation, this very insidery conversation that's happening. There's a fear, I think, on some people that because of the president's resounding victory is in some ways a double-edged sword, because at one level it shows that he campaigned on some of the progressive priorities, particularly on taxes at the high end, but also that he doesn't have anyone to worry about, and that he is like free range to make this deal. What is your theory of action here about how you exert some real kind of grassroots accountability on this conversation, which is happening at a very insider baseball kind of way?
Well, let's just take the Senator Durbin action, which was last Friday. I mean, what would have happened if people didn't move into the streets and occupy the building and get arrested was Senator Durbin, we got a sign-on letter from all the organizations in Illinois saying, like, don't do a bad deal. Like, that's not going to get it done. And Senator Durbin is not used to having progressive people and communities of color and labor activists come to his office and do a demonstration. It definitely shakes up the way he thinks about this debate and makes him react. And the Senate's a key firewall in ensuring we don't have a bad deal. And so Democratic senators need to be held accountable. So that's part of the theory. I think, secondly, this is difficult stuff to understand. Like, I mean, this is like, if you want to, like, I mean, I don't know if we're probably killing ratings right now talking about the fiscal cliff. So it is, I think these demonstrations and the level of people putting their bodies on the line, and these were like students, clergy. I was in the holding tank with a senior who was 75, who was trembling and barely able to even stand up with his face against the wall, cuffed for 3 hours. Basically saying, hey, you all need to wake up, because this is a big deal. You voted for fairness, but you're not going to get fairness just because you voted. So I think that's a key. And then I think on the Republican side, we know that a lot of people that voted Republican are actually with us on this issue. And so how do we get in there and actually start to organize people and build a leverage and wedge there?
In one issue here, I just want to show this because I think that's a really key point. Like, here's Bill Kristol last week saying basically, do we really need to protect these tax cuts at the top? And one of the most consistent polling results as we followed the campaign was that raising taxes on people at the top is incredibly popular. It's a majority position among Republicans in these polls.
And the other very popular position is don't cut benefits on Medicare, Medicaid, or Social Security. And that's a majority position among Republican voters, too. And what is amazing to me right now is you open up the paper, watch on television, there's Boehner, McConnell, all the Republicans insisting you've got to have major entitlement cuts. What does that mean? Cuts in Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Right after the Republicans just got finished beating up on the Democrats for allegedly taking $716 billion from Medicare. That's terrible. Now they're going to insist we have to take more money from Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. And if the Democrats are stupid enough to go along with that, they will criticize the Democrats in the next election for agreeing with them.
That's a great point. Heather, you were in Washington. You and I were both there at the same time and watched the kind of sausage making happen. Like, how much leverage do you think there is?
Right. I think that's a really good question. I think, unfortunately, we may have to get through this period of time of complete detachment from reality. And then the conversation will shift as it will as people start to gear up for the midterms. People will start looking out into the country again and saying, hey, we're still at about 8% unemployment out here. Jobs are still the number one concern of voters, not of the donor class, but of voters. And so then there's going to be a whole, okay, we've got all these discretionary spending caps, but what can we actually do to get these people back to work? And then we will have to redo this.
But the problem, though, is that a bad deal can get baked in the interim. And I wonder, like, is it possible to create? I mean, when you're talking about social insurance, about Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, there's some reporting suggesting that Jack Lew, who was at OMB and is now the president's chief of staff, that in the last round of these basically said Medicaid, no means no, can't touch Medicaid. Right. And partly that's because that's
the Medicare, I assume.
And well, this was on Medicaid, no, because Medicare is much more open. On Medicaid, that's a huge part of how the Affordable Care Act is going to get its expansion of people covered.
Right.
Medicare, they've already done some stuff, as we know, as we found out from the campaign, they've done some stuff in terms of the payments to providers, and in the president's own proposal right now, there's some additional changes to payment formulas, right? So that's already on the table. But are there red lines for you, Congressman? Because here's an interesting way this is going to come down. If there's any revenue at all in this deal, if there is a deal, they're going to lose a lot of people on the House Republican caucus. They might lose 30, they might lose 40, they might lose 50, they might lose 60, they might lose 70, depending on how much revenue's on the table, which means in order for it to pass, Nancy Pelosi is going to have to come over and come knock on your door. And so what are your red lines on this?
I suppose I'll have a number of red lines. Number one, not a nickel in reductions in cost of living increase for Social Security, not a nickel in reductions of benefits to Medicare and Medicaid. Those are probably the most prominent red lines. And then I'd want to see...
That's interesting.
I'd want to see... where you draw the red line, I don't know. But I don't want to see more cuts in discretionary spending. I don't want to see more increases to the military. I don't want to see revenues, so-called, that will impact the middle class, like eliminating state and local tax. That's a very important one.
Yeah.
Some of the proposals that are on the table now, that came from Romney, that some Democrats are now saying were a great idea. Let's cap deductions at $35,000 or $40,000. That will, in a high-tax state like New York, that will really almost eliminate, to a large extent, deductibility of state and local taxes, which in turn will put tremendous more pressure on state and local governments not to provide social services, not to do social spending, and to cut their spending. So it'll ratchet it right down. I wouldn't go along with that.
It would be amazing if the losing candidate's sort of signature policy, which itself was kind of ad hoc reverse engineered around the things he didn't want to say, was what ended up being.
We see people like Ken Conrad now saying it's a good idea. Now let me be very clear. You can start reducing upper income deductions as we used to do. That's one thing, but hard caps on deductibility that impact the state and local tax deductibility, out of the question.
I want to get your sense of where you think the president is on this right after we take this break. Joy, the president had a meeting yesterday with the congressional leadership. What smoke signals do you think are coming out from the White House about all of this?
You know, it's interesting because I think that functionally Barack Obama has been probably the most progressive president that we've had, you know, in my lifetime, certainly. But I do think that he, to a certain extent, believes in this idea of deficit reduction.
Yeah.
And I think that confounds a lot of people on the left because he does seem to genuinely believe that he needs to tackle deficits, partly because of the Bill Clinton example, that is part of it's a legacy thing.
Yeah, right.
And I think he genuinely believes it. So I think the concern for people on the left has to be that he's coming from a place of he does want to go at the deficit now. He would do a grand bargain. I have to be honest with you, I think part of the grand bargain the last time was a little bit of a head fake. It was a little bit of saying, if I give you this, everything you should want, and you still say no, because I know you're going to say no.
Then it shows
I've been shown that you're unreasonable. So I think that the Bob Woodward, all those leaks, I think a little bit of that we need to take with a grain of salt. But I do think he does subscribe.
This point, I think, is really important, and I'm not huge for psychoanalyzing our public figures, but I do think just all the reporting, people that have been in meetings with the press, everything suggests that this isn't some fabricated thing. It's not something out of convenience. It's not out of political pressure.
No.
He genuinely believes that we need to get our quote-unquote fiscal house in order, that we need to reduce the projections, we need to stabilize debt to GDP. That is actually a genuine priority of the President of the United States.
And here's what I would love, though, for him to just add to the conversation. Is let's do it with a trigger of our own, which is let's put all this in, bake this all in the cake, and say it doesn't come into play until we get down to 6% unemployment for 2 consecutive quarters or something, right? Because then you're actually teasing out what really we know by the fiscal cliff, which is that if you go to austerity, it's going to cost jobs.
And this is because Boehner's now floating some other. Boehner's thing yesterday was, okay, well, I think we have the architecture for a deal here is that we come up with some other thing, some other like time detonated device in the future. So it's like I keep thinking that it's just going to get worse and worse. Like, okay, 6 months we don't have a deal, we all have to stab ourselves in the eye, and then after that, then we all have to run around naked for a month in January. Like what? Like just actually do the thing and stop saying you're going to do something crazy to yourselves afterwards.
But don't do the thing, because the thing is going to torpedo the economy. Right. The thing is austerity.
But everybody believes that ultimately we have to get our fiscal house in order. We have to deal with the deficit. The divide is how do you do it? You don't do it by austerity, by cutting your spending, by driving your economy worse into a recession or depression, throwing more people out of work, and having a bigger deficit, which is what's happening in Europe.
Right.
You do it by spending the money to invest in people, in infrastructure, by putting people to work, and by reducing the deficit by having more tax revenues as a result of that.
I think the sequencing point here is key, and that's what we're talking about. But what you said, and when you opened the show, just really struck me. We talk a lot. We want to put people back to work. We've got a big gap between people who want to go to work and work that needs to be done, and people want to be able to put, money in the bank and pay for the cost it takes to raise a family, but this gap between people wanting to contribute and not being able to contribute in this country, that's a moral crisis. And that's got to be dealt with first.
That's a deficit. There's a deficit. There's a mismatch.
There's a $1 trillion demand deficit, right? And there's also a generational deficit. We're talking about young people who, if they're lucky enough to be able to graduate from college, have graduated into an economy that basically says we don't want your labor. And
but we do want your debt payments.
Exactly. We want your checks to the bank, but we don't want your labor. We don't want your ideas. We don't want your contribution. And there is another way to go. I mean, we crunched some numbers and put out a proposal that Jan Schakowsky actually took up, which is the idea that we could actually do the most economically efficient thing to get people back to work, which is put people back to work. We could have 1 million public service jobs, people from all over the country, young people going to, flying to Arizona, to Nevada, wherever, working side by side to build this country back up. Not just hard infrastructure, but working in, daycare centers and childcare centers. This could be like a generation-defining thing that would be more economically efficient to put people back to work than practically anything else that we do.
Can I make my name ironic for just one moment? Yeah. Just to take all the joy out of the idea of us thinking of a progressive future. Look, the reality is that the last time that we did an attack on the economic problem, on the economic crisis, governors were given money, right, in the stimulus. Yeah. But what did most of them do? They reduced their public sector workforces. Right. Most of the job decline has been because governors, because states directly and deliberately reduced
their workforce. Well, that was after 2010.
And so did the federal government.
Wait. That was after the stimulus money wore out.
Yeah. Right.
The stimulus money that was given to states and local governments, about $240 billion, kept local public servants at work, kept governments from laying off people, kept governments from not giving the contract to the private guy to fix the potholes.
Right, that was initially.
Yes, but
and
when that wore
too.
out and we didn't replace it, then they started.
Right, but I mean, in the federal level, we had also reductions in the federal workforce. We're now going after the post office at the federal level. The guys in Congress want to get rid of the post office and privatize it, which is another 30-something.
We've been basically throwing the car in reverse.
Exactly.
George Gale, Executive Director of National People's Action. Heather McGhee from the progressive think tank Demos. Thanks for joining us this morning. When you're arrested outside Congressman Nadler's office, we'll have you both back on the program to discuss it. Really great.
I appreciate you.
We'll see you tomorrow, right?
Yeah.
All right. While Washington obsesses over the non-pressing issue of national debt, Occupy Wall Street goes after debt that is destroying lives as we speak. That's up next. All right, we've been talking about Washington's preoccupation to an irrational degree with debts and deficits. On Thursday, AFL-CIO President Richard Trumka expressed frustration with Washington's debt obsession, saying, quote, "What we're facing is an obstacle course within a manufactured crisis that was hastily thrown together in response to inflated rhetoric about our federal deficit. All the deficit chatter has distracted us from our real crisis, the immediate crisis of 23 million unemployed or underemployed workers." Trumka's lament points to something fairly insidious about Washington's debt obsession. Not only has it eclipsed the reality of the lagging recovery, it has also obscured another much more dire debt crisis in America, one that continues to suppress economic growth and cause mass suffering for millions of Americans. That's the overhang of household debt left from the bursting of the housing bubble. Americans remain massively overleveraged with more than $11 trillion in household debt, most of which is mortgage debt. There seems to be essentially no political will to deal with this, which is why an ingenious new plan by organizers associated with Occupy Wall Street is so fascinating and potentially game-changing. The Occupy offshoot, called Strike Debt, is raising money to buy debt for pennies on the dollar. Usually that debt is bought by third parties looking to collect on the amount owed by the borrower. But Strike Debt is doing something incredible. They're buying the debt and then canceling it, period. No questions asked. They're calling it a rolling jubilee after the biblical tradition of forgiving debts periodically. Since their online telethon on Thursday night, they've raised nearly $300,000 to buy and forgive nearly $6 million worth of debt. Joining me at the table are Astra Taylor, an organizer of the Rolling Jubilee and co-editor of Occupy, Scenes from Occupied America. Amin Hussein returning us, editor of Title Magazine, who's also an organizer of Rolling Jubilee. Sarah Ludwig, founder and co-director of the Neighborhood Economic Development Project, which advocates for poor and underrepresented communities. And Doug Henwood, editor and publisher of the legendary Left Business Review, author of a fantastic book called Wall Street, which you can ever find anywhere. You should absolutely read, and a colleague of mine at The Nation magazine. All right, so why debt? Why have you guys come around organizing on debt as this sort of singular issue?
Well, we are part of an offshoot of Occupy Wall Street that's called Strike Debt, and Strike Debt emerged out of the recognition that debt was sort of the way many people attracted to Occupy Wall Street early on. They identified as debtors, right? So you, thinking back to an early day at the park, at Zuccotti Park, a young man was saying, "Step right up and write down what you're worth to the 1%. And people were putting down these incredible numbers. I remember a moment of hesitation in myself when I got nervous before writing down the $45,000 I owed in student loans. The girl behind me wrote down $120,000. An older woman wrote down, a large, I think it was about $50,000 of medical debt. And people were naming this and coming out. So people involved in Occupy from the beginning identified as debtors. It's something that moved them to action. And Strike Debt emerged earlier this summer, partly in solidarity with international movements against austerity and the Quebec protests in Montreal, where students were protesting tuition hikes and sporting the red square that I'm wearing, which symbolized squarely in the red, if you cut education, we'll all be in debt. And they were pointing to bigger social problems, the privatization of all sorts of social services. So Strike Debt has come out of that.
Why do you think it has the emotional resonance it does? Like, why was that the thing? Because I remember, like, in the I Am the 99%, like that website, right? Mm-hmm. And people were writing down kind of their story, and a lot of them were revolved around debt. I mean, why do you think debt has the emotional resonance it does?
Because debt is isolating and it's individualizing, and we live in a society right now where we're under so much burden of debt that it makes sense when you look at the 99% and 77% of Americans have debt, and those that don't have debt are affected by it, that the choices that we make in our lives, for example, are based on whether we can pay back or not, and what type of jobs we'll accept, and who we become, and what do we choose to study when we go to school, and what choices we make as parents and as mothers and as fathers in terms of our children. I have a friend who used to work at a law firm. He still works at a law firm, and he never liked his job, but he stayed in it because he didn't want his children to have to take out loans to go to school. Right. So it's very personal.
It's funny you say that, because I was at the telethon on Thursday night, and I was struck by this thing Reverend Jacqueline Lewis said. She was there, and they did a gospel song, and she talked about the biblical tradition of Jubilee and about the way in which debt and freedom are in tension. Take a look.
A whole lot of our population is in shackles. Amen? Absolutely overwhelmed, can't get out of it. Credit card debt, paying, 16% interest. Something you bought for $100 ends up costing you $2,000 before you pay it off. Education debt. Can't get out, can't get a job, can't get free. Hospital, healthcare debt. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Jesus, who was a rabbi and whom often many of us think of as the child of God, was saying this is the way to freedom. This is the way to liberation. Debts need to be canceled. And all of that cancellation is called a year of Jubilee.
I want to talk about the way debt shapes the lives of people in the communities that you work with, and the role that debt plays in American capitalism, right after we take this break. Here's a chart that gives you a little bit of a sense of the trends in debt, and I always find this chart really interesting. It's historical private debt to GDP ratio, so private debt to GDP ratio. And what you see is basically it peaks on the eve of the Great Crash that precipitates the Great Depression. Then there's a massive period of deleveraging, and then it goes up again and peaks on the eve in 2007 at the end of the housing bubble on the eve of the second Great Crash. And you see it started to come down, but there's a very long way to go. And Sarah, I want you to tell me about the communities you work in, how the role that debt plays in people's lives there, how it structures people's behavior and the decisions they make.
Yeah, I mean, you asked before why debt resonates so much with people, and it's because there's been this explosion in credit and indebtedness. And we work with mostly low-income people and people of color in New York City, and what's really plaguing them is abusive debt collection practices. So they're wildly indebted. Over half of households making less than $50,000 now use credit for basic expenses. So to cover, food, medicine, utility bills, and so forth, because we don't have, we've had stagnant wages, we don't have a living wage, people are absolutely struggling. You have one unforeseen, visit to the emergency room and you're just not wiped out financially. And so you have, the fact that people don't have access to affordable health care and insurance and so forth. So we work with people who actually are being pulled into the world of relentlessly, aggressively harassing debt buyers and debt collectors. And anyone who's gotten those phone calls knows that it is a plague, and it's really, really focused on low-income people in our experience.
The debt collection, the debt buying industry has exploded, right? So the idea is, there's someone who can't pay back their debts, and you've tried to extract from them, and you think, you know what, I'm just going to get out of this while I can. I'll sell it to someone at 5 cents on the dollar, and then that person now has an incentive to hound the person to see if they can cut a deal to get 6 cents on the dollar, 7 cents on the dollar, right? Because that's their margin of profit. This is, in 1995, the debt buying industry was at $12 billion. And by 2008, it was up to $215 billion. So there's been an explosion in this. And the average amount owed per debt collection rose from under $900 in 2003 to $1,600 in 2012. So we've seen both a rise in the industry of buying this debt, and we've also seen a rise in the amount that people owe. Doug, you've written, I think, sort of both affectionately and critically about what strike debt is doing. And one of the points you've made is, look, debt in and of itself plays a very important role. And you say, well, debt is entrapping or something. But, you know, if you take out debt and you get a good education and that's a good investment in building up your skills and then you can pay it off, there's certain debt that debt in and of itself is not bad and actually plays a really vital role.
Yeah, well, that chart you had, the private debt to GDP ratio, falls off at the end. And what we've been going through for the last few years is people have been deleveraging. That's why the economy is so stagnant. The economy is very dependent on high levels of debt to keep going. And
explain what deleveraging is.
Just people paying off debt, not paying debt, not taking out new debt.
Getting rid of the amount they owe.
Getting down the debt to income ratio.
Right.
And we've been going through that for 4 or 5 years. A lot of countries around the world have been doing something very similar, but we're actually further along than just about anybody else is. And that, debt, I think, is also a symptom. I mean, if we go back to the late 70s, early 80s, when we first saw the Volcker-Reagan crackdown, the end of inflation of the 70s, a real assault on the living standards of the working class, union busting, all that, all the outsourcing, everything has become familiar since. We have an economy that's very dependent on mass purchasing power, and if people's wages and living standards are under attack, how do you sustain the mass purchasing power? It's through borrowing, and most of the borrowing has come through mortgages, directly or indirectly. So the macroeconomy has become very dependent on that. But the number of people who are really seriously debt distressed, it's a minority of the population. It's a suffering minority, and I don't want to
minimize that.
To minimize their suffering, but it's 10-15% of the population. But it's also a symptom of something that's much larger, is the real stress on living standards, the stress on incomes, the inability of people to make ends meet. So if we're talking specific medical debt, we have a crazy healthcare finance system. Education debt. Education should be free.
I want to talk about what produces this debt and also get into the nitty-gritty of how you're going to forgive it right after we take a break.